Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, specifically the roles of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. And we're going to be drawing from a really cool podcast episode from Mr. Hutchings History. And it turns out the story's a little bit more complicated than most people realize when it comes to these two presidents.
It is. We have this popular image of Kennedy as a champion of civil rights. But when you really dig into the history, it gets a little bit more complicated.
It does, like those old black and white photographs, right? They tell a story. But there's so much more happening off camera behind the scenes. So what was the real story with Kennedy and civil rights?
Well, to understand Kennedy, you have to remember the political landscape of the early 1960s. The South was deeply resistant to change. Southern Democrats held a lot of power in Congress. And Kennedy needed their support. He needed their support to get anything done, so he had to tread carefully.
So he was walking a political tightrope there, trying to not alienate Southern voters, but also respond to these growing demands for racial equality across the country.
Yeah, I could see how that would lead to some hesitation.
Exactly. And that hesitation played out in a number of key events. Take the Freedom Rides, for instance. You have these incredibly courageous activists who are challenging segregation on interstate buses and facing tremendous danger and violence.
Yeah, I remember learning about the Freedom Rides in school.
Yeah.
The images of burdened buses and brutal attacks they're pretty hard to forget. How did Kennedy react to all that?
At first, his administration was very reluctant to intervene directly. They were worried about pushing too hard too fast and losing Southern support for other key policies.
So they're prioritizing political strategy
Yeah.
over immediate action.
Yeah.
It makes sense in a cold political calculus.
But it must have been so frustrating for the activists who were literally risking their lives out there.
Absolutely. It took intense pressure from the public, horrifying images of violence being broadcast across the nation,
Yeah.
for the Kennedys to finally send federal marshals to protect the writers. And even then, it felt more like a reaction to a crisis than a proactive stance on civil rights.
It seems like Kennedy was constantly reacting to events rather than driving them. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, look at James Meredith's attempt to integrate the University of Mississippi. Here was a brave individual challenging segregation head-on, and the response was explosive. I mean, a full-blown riot erupted on campus, with white moms attacking federal marshals who were sent to protect Meredith.
Wow. A full-blown riot. That's intense. It sounds like the South was really pushing back hard against integration. What did Kennedy do in that situation?
He eventually sent in federal troops to quell the violence and ensure that Meredith could enroll. But again, it was a reactive move. It took significant bloodshed and chaos before Kennedy felt compelled to act decisively.
Man, it's hard to imagine the pressure he must have been under, trying to balance his own beliefs with the political realities of the time. It makes you wonder if he ever felt truly comfortable taking a strong public stand on civil rights.
That's a great question, and it's one that historians still debate today. But there's another event that I think really highlights Kennedy's cautious approach: the March on Washington.
Oh, wow. The March on Washington, that's such an iconic event, right? With Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Was Kennedy fully supportive of that?
Actually, no. Initially, he was quite opposed to it. He feared it could lead to violence and unrest, which would damage his image and potentially hurt his chances of re-election.
So even with this massive demonstration for racial equality gaining momentum, Kennedy was still prioritizing political optics.
It seems that way. He tried to discourage the organizers, even suggested alternative events. He even tried to dictate the content of the speeches, wanting to avoid anything too inflammatory. Only when it became clear that the march would happen with or without his blessing did he finally relent. But even then, it was under strict conditions.
Wow, I never knew that. It kind of changes the way you look at those iconic photos of the march, knowing that the president was so hesitant about it all.
Right. It shows that even as the tide of public opinion was turning, Kennedy was still very much operating within the constraints of the political system. He recognized the need for change, but he wasn't willing to risk alienating a significant portion of the electorate.
So it seems like with Kennedy, there was this constant tension between his awareness of the moral imperative of civil rights and his very pragmatic approach to politics.
Exactly. And that tension really comes into focus when you compare him to Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president after Kennedy's assassination.
Now, Johnson was a Southern politician, a Texan. You wouldn't necessarily expect him to be a champion for civil rights.
You wouldn't. And yet, Johnson surprised everyone. Where Kennedy was hesitant and cautious, Johnson was bold and decisive. He possessed a deep understanding of the legislative process, and he had this knack for getting things done in Congress.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. How did Johnson approach civil rights differently?
Well, let's start with Kennedy's stalled civil rights bill. It had been languishing in Congress, facing strong opposition from Southern Democrats. Johnson, however, saw an opportunity.
He wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers.
Not at all. He used all his political savvy, his backroom negotiating skills, and his deep understanding of the Senate to push that bill through. He called in favors, made compromises where necessary, and ultimately succeeded in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
That's huge. The Civil Rights Act was a landmark achievement. It outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, schools, and employment. It's hard to overstate its impact on American society.
It was a turning point. And Johnson wasn't done. He understood that securing voting rights was crucial to achieving true equality for African Americans.
And this is where the Selma to Montgomery marches come in, right? Those images of peaceful protesters being brutally attacked by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday. Those images shock the nation.
Yes, and Johnson seized that moment. He addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering this powerful speech that echoed the words of the movement. He declared, "We shall overcome." And he used the momentum generated by Selma to push for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally guaranteed the right to vote for African Americans in the South.
So while Kennedy seemed to shy away from confrontation, Johnson embraced it, using his political power to push for real, tangible change. It's a stark contrast.
It is, and it raises an interesting question. Did Johnson's Southern background actually give him an advantage in this situation? Was he able to connect with Southern lawmakers in a way that Kennedy, a Northerner, could not?
Yeah.
It's something to ponder as we continue our deep dive.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? You think of LBJ, a Southern politician through and through, as the one who ultimately delivers on these landmark civil rights achievements. It really makes you reconsider those easy assumptions we sometimes make about people, huh?
It's a total curveball, yeah. You'd think a guy from Texas in the 60s would be the last person to champion civil rights.
Yeah.
But maybe that's exactly what gave him the leverage that he needed to make it happen.
That's a great point. Johnson had this kind of folksy charm and a deep understanding of the Southern mindset. He knew how to speak their language, how to appeal to their sense of tradition and fairness, even while pushing for what many considered at the time radical change. Yeah, it sounds like he was playing 4D chess while everyone else is stuck on checkers. But let's not forget the bigger picture here, right? The civil rights movement wasn't just a domestic issue. The Cold War was raging, and America's racial injustices were being broadcast on the world stage.
Absolutely. The Soviets were using America's hypocrisy on race as propaganda. They were highlighting the gap between its ideals of freedom and the reality of discrimination. It was a major embarrassment for the U.S., and it put pressure on both Kennedy and Johnson to act.
So Kennedy was worried about America's image abroad, while Johnson saw an opportunity to leverage the Cold War to kind of push his own agenda.
Exactly. For Kennedy, it was about containing the damage, trying to present a more unified front to the world. But Johnson was bolder. He used the Cold War to his advantage. He argued that passing strong civil rights legislation would strengthen America's moral standing and help it win the hearts and minds of people around the world.
Man, it's amazing how he managed to turn that potential weakness into a strength. He basically said, look, we're dealing with our problems, we're committed to equality, and that makes us stronger in the fight against communism. Pretty brilliant.
It was, and it worked. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act sent a powerful message to the world that America was serious about change.
Okay, so we've talked about the political calculations, we talked about the international context, but let's not forget the real driving force behind all this progress, the civil rights movement itself. These were brave activists who were putting their lives on the line, demanding change. How did they influence Kennedy and Johnson's actions?
Their impact cannot be overstated. The Freedom Riders, the sit-ins, the marches, the countless acts of courage and defiance, they created the pressure, the moral urgency that forced the government to take notice.
They were the ones on the front lines, right? Facing down fire hoses and police dogs, risking imprisonment and violence. They were the ones pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable at the time and really forcing the nation to confront its own hypocrisy.
Exactly. And while both Kennedy and Johnson responded to this pressure, they did so in very different ways. Kennedy, as we've discussed, was more cautious, more concerned with maintaining the status quo. He acted when he had to, but rarely led the charge.
Right. But Johnson, He was a different breed. He understood the power of the movement, the power of their message. And he wasn't afraid to use his political muscle to turn that power into legislation.
Right, he was a master of the political game. But he also seemed to have, I think, a genuine respect for the activists, recognizing their courage and the righteousness of their cause. He saw an opportunity to make history, and he seized it.
So what were the lasting impacts of Kennedy and Johnson's presidencies on the fight for equality? It seems like both played a role,
Yeah.
but in very different ways.
Well, the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act under Johnson were undoubtedly landmark achievements. They outlawed discrimination, secured voting rights for African Americans, and fundamentally changed the legal and social landscape of the nation.
Those were real tangible victories that continue to shape American society today. They laid the groundwork for so much progress, even if we still have a long way to go.
Absolutely. And while Kennedy's legacy is more complicated, he did help to raise awareness of civil rights and pave the way for Johnson's legislative triumph.
It's like he planted the seeds, but Johnson was the one who cultivated them and brought forth the harvest.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of lessons, let's circle back to that question we posed to our listener earlier. How can we apply what we've learned about Kennedy, Johnson, and the civil rights movement to the challenges we face today? What are the key takeaways?
I think one big takeaway is the power of collective action. The civil rights movement wasn't about one person or one event. It was about a movement of people united in their demand for justice. It shows us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they come together.
I completely agree. And it also highlights the importance of leadership that is both responsive and proactive. Both Kennedy and Johnson responded to the demands of the movement. But Johnson went a step further. He used his political savvy to push for real, lasting change.
So it's not enough to just acknowledge a problem. Real leaders need to be willing to take action, to use their power and influence to make a difference. And that requires courage, vision, and a deep commitment to justice.
And let's not forget the importance of understanding the political system and how to work within it to achieve your goals. Johnson was a master strategist, and he knew how to use the levers of power to get things done.
He was like a chess grandmaster, right? Always thinking several moves ahead, anticipating his opponent's reactions. And in this case, his mastery of the game resulted in some of the most important legislation in American history.
Precisely. But it's also important to remember that political maneuvering alone is not enough. It must be coupled with a genuine commitment to the cause, a willingness to fight for what is right, even when it's difficult.
It's that combination of strategy and principle, I think, that makes a truly effective leader, someone who can navigate the complexities of the political landscape while remaining true to their values.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this deep dive. The different ways historians interpret the roles of Kennedy and Johnson in the civil rights movement.
Okay, so this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of historical analysis. It's not just about what happened, but how different historians view those events, right?
Yeah, it's like looking at a painting from different angles. You might notice details you missed before, or see the whole picture in a new light. Exactly. So let's start with the revisionist historians. They're kind of the mythbusters of history. They challenge traditional narratives, and they dig deeper to uncover less flattering truths. When it comes to Kennedy and civil rights, they tend to be pretty critical.
Oh, really? What don't they like about Kennedy? I thought he was generally seen as a progressive force.
Well, the revisionists argue that Kennedy's actions were often more symbolic than substantive. They say he was a master of rhetoric, inspiring people with his speeches, but he was slow to commit to real policy changes, especially when it came to civil rights. They see him as more reactive than proactive.
So they think he was all talk and no action.
Not exactly. They acknowledge that he did take some important steps, like sending federal troops to integrate Ole Miss and supporting the Freedom Rides. But they argue that he only did so when pressured by events or public opinion. He wasn't willing to risk his political capital by pushing for civil rights legislation until it became politically expedient.
It's like he was dipping his toes in the water, testing the temperature, before fully committing.
That's a good way to put it. And in contrast, they see Johnson as a much more effective leader on civil rights, someone who was willing to use his political power to get things done.
Okay, so that's the revisionist take. What about other perspectives?
Well, institutional historians take a different approach. They focus on how political institutions shape the actions of individuals. They're less interested in personal motivations and more interested in the nuts and bolts of how things work in government.
So they'd be fascinated by Johnson's mastery of the Senate, his ability to wheel and deal and get legislation passed.
Exactly. They'd see him as a quintessential political operator, someone who knew how to work the system to achieve his goals. They'd point to his deep understanding of congressional procedures, his relationships with key lawmakers, and his willingness to compromise as key factors in his success.
It sounds like they admire his pragmatism, his ability to get things done, even in a difficult political environment.
That's right. And they might even argue that his Southern background gave him an advantage. He understood the nuances of Southern politics, the unspoken rules, the fears and prejudices that were holding back progress.
So he was able to speak to Southern lawmakers in a way that Kennedy, a Northerner, never could.
Precisely. And then there are the Cold War historians. They view everything through the lens of the global struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
So for them, the civil rights movement wasn't just about racial equality. It was also about America's image on the world stage.
Exactly. The Soviets were using America's racial problems as propaganda, highlighting the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to be a beacon of freedom while denying basic rights to its own citizens.
It must have been embarrassing for the U.S. having their dirty laundry aired for the whole world to see.
It was. And it put pressure on American leaders to address the issue of racial inequality, not just for moral reasons, but also for strategic reasons.
So Kennedy and Johnson were both influenced by the Cold War context, but in different ways. Kennedy was more concerned with optics, with making sure America looked good to the rest of the world, while Johnson saw an opportunity to use the Cold War to his advantage to push for civil rights legislation. That would strengthen America's moral authority.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how domestic politics and international relations can intersect and shape each other.
Okay, so we've got the revisionists, the institutionalists, and the Cold War historians. Who else is weighing in on this historical debate?
Well, we can't forget the civil rights historians. They bring a unique perspective, focusing on the agency and experiences of the activists themselves.
They're the ones who remind us that the movement wasn't just about presidents and policies. It was about ordinary people who took extraordinary risks to fight for justice.
Exactly. They highlight the courage of the freedom riders, the determination of the sit-in participants, the resilience of the marchers who faced down violence and oppression.
Yeah. They remind us that change doesn't happen from the top down. It happens from the bottom up. It's the people who make history, even if they don't always get the credit they deserve.
And they might argue that both Kennedy and Johnson were ultimately responding to the pressure created by the movement, rather than leading the charge.
So it's a more nuanced picture than we often get in traditional history books. It's not just about great men making decisions in smoke-filled rooms. It's about a complex interplay of forces, individual leaders, social movements, political institutions, and global events.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just a collection of facts and dates. It's a story that's constantly being rewritten, reinterpreted, and debated.
Yeah. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and that our understanding of the past is always evolving.
And that brings us back to our listener. We've explored the different approaches of Kennedy and Johnson, the political and historical context, and the lasting impact of their presidencies on the struggle for equality. But the question remains, what lessons can we draw from all this? How can we apply these insights to the challenges we face today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think one takeaway is that real change requires both vision and pragmatism. We need leaders who can inspire us with their ideals, but also who can navigate the messy realities of politics to get things done.
Absolutely. We also need to remember the power of collective action. The civil rights movement succeeded because ordinary people came together to demand justice. We can't rely on our leaders alone to solve our problems. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable society.
And finally, we need to stay engaged, to keep learning from the past, and to never give up the fight for a better future. The struggle for equality is an ongoing process, and it requires our constant attention and effort.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I encourage you to reflect on what you've learned and to consider how you can apply these insights to your own life. How can you be a force for positive change in your community? How can you honor the legacy of those who fought for justice? By continuing the struggle in your own time.
Those are powerful questions, and ones that I hope our listeners will continue to ponder long after this deep dive is over. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time. for another fascinating exploration of history, ideas, and the human experience.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.